Thank you so much for being here this evening. My name is Michael Fraud. I am the Assistant Program Director at Drisha, and it's a huge pleasure to have you all here as part of our ELL program. Tonight is the first of our classes with Sarah Zager, who is going to be teaching tonight as well as for the next few weeks on Can We Change Our Character? Perspectives from Bavli to the Musar movement. The series will investigate whether and how we might be able to change our characters and using sources ranging from the Gemara to the Mishneh Torah to the Musar movement. We're going to explore how characters are formed, what tools we might have when we decide that we need to change our dispositions and our tendencies for the better. And we're going to be paying particular attention to the role that interpersonal interactions between students and teachers or between friends can play in this process. This particular session is focused on the question of, is Teshuvah a miracle? So our teacher for the next few weeks is Sarah Zager, who is a doctoral candidate in religious studies and philosophy at Yale University, where her research focuses on the influence of Judaism and Christianity on moral philosophy. Originally from Albuquerque, New Mexico, Sarah has an MA in religion from the University of Chicago Divinity School, as well as a BA from Williams College, and is currently David Hartman Center Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, as well as the recipient of a number of other fellowships and has been published in a variety of different publications. So we are really thrilled to have all of you here with us. We're thrilled to have the opportunity to learn with Sarah. And Sarah, I think whenever you're ready, you can take it away.
Great, thank you, Michael, so much. It's really a joy to be learning together with you this ELL, which I know can feel a little bit, at least for me, has felt sort of distant and strange. And we'll be talking throughout the series about the importance of interpersonal interaction in Teshuvah, and I think that's, it's a little bit of a strange thing to be doing when our interpersonal interactions are a little bit halting, but also I think maybe an opportunity to think about like the ways in which those interpersonal interactions are important to us. So basically the kind of arc of this class overall is going to be sort of three little looks into thinking about whether we actually can change our character. So the first session will be looking at mostly rabbinic sources. Next week, we have the Rambam's masterpiece in Hilchot Teshuvah, which is a sort of attempt to grapple with the idea that Teshuvah is possible and an Aristotelian philosophical tradition that is like really skeptical that we actually can change our character at all. And then in the last week, we'll be spending some time on the Musar movement, this sort of 19th century Lithuanian like bubbling up of interest in ethics, which really gives a whole set of methods and tools and kind of structures for thinking about how we might change our character. That's the kind of overall arc of where we're going to go. Today, I really want to spend most of our time thinking about sort of what is actually going on Yom Kippur and in the sort of lead up to Yom Kippur. So what kind of transformation are we imagining Teshuvah to be? And I basically want to suggest that there are at least two models in rabbinic sources. For that, I think there are definitely more, but I want to focus on two. And so in order to see that, we're going to start with a text that should be pretty familiar. I'm just going to quickly share screen so we can all see. Here we go. Everybody, can everybody see the screen? Everybody's got the text? Yeah? Good? Okay. So just one methodological note as we go. I'll pause for questions and ask people to kind of jump in as we go, but also you should feel free to use the chat. And I'll be monitoring that to some extent, but Michael will sort of also be helping me monitor the chat. So let's jump right in. I want to start with a text that I think will be familiar to most of us, but maybe it's been a while since you've looked at it. It was a while since I looked at it. A text from the end of the Yom Kippur Amidah. And I think it kind of at the two different models of Teshuvah that I want to talk about and kind of laces them together in an interesting way. I'm just going to read this text, which I think we don't say aloud very often, but is a kind of important moment in the Yom Kippur liturgy. Elohai, ad shelo nosarti eini chadai, va'achshav shenosarti ki'ilu lo nosarti. Afar ani b'chayai, kal v'chomer b'mitati. Harei ani lefanecha, kichli mal'ei busha uchlima. So, my God, before I was formed, I was insufficient, or almost not formed. Now that I have been formed, it's as if I was never formed. I am dust and ashes, even in life and even more so in death. I stand before you full of embarrassment and shame. And here's the part that I really want to dig into. So you're in this sentence, right? We're asking God to stop us from sinning again. That's one thing that's going on here. And then in the next line, and also, may you erase my sins through sort of your mercy. So like, don't do it through some sort of pain or illness. So in those last couple of lines, those last few sentences, we see two, I think, distinct models of Teshuvah. One is asking God to become the kind of person that won't sin again, which I think is a sort of characterological shift, right? I'm asking that I won't fall into the same old trap. And then in the second half, actually what you're asking God to do is erase the sins that you've committed, which seems like this kind of like divine intervention in sort of the ledger of who has done well and who has done poorly, and what things you've done well and what things you've done poorly. And they're sort of in the liturgy like matched right up against each other as these two different models. So what I want to spend time talking about today is like, what do those models have to do with each other? Are they in competition? Are they do they work sort of in opposite directions? Do they work in the same direction? Is one of them more compelling than another? I'm sort of, at the end of this, I don't want to decide like, yes, this one is the good one and this one is the bad one, but I want to see these different voices like coming through in the tradition. Does anyone have just like thoughts or questions about this, or even reactions of like, one of these models seems to be much more compelling than the other one? I hate one of them, etc. You should feel free to use the raise hands function if you'd like, or to use the chat as you wish. Reactions to those models, thus far. Okay, well, we can think about those as we go. So here are a couple texts that I think kind of present this model where Teshuvah is a miracle, by which I mean God is going to actually intervene and make it so that it's as if you didn't sin at all. So let's jump into the next text, which is a sort of from a litany of different rabbis imagining Teshuvah in lots of different ways. It's on near the end of Yoma. And we're going to be looking at a few of these different snippets. There are many, many more, and you should all go and learn that whole collection because it gives kind of a wider range of models. But these two are really interesting. Okay. Tanya, we learned our breita. Haya Rabbi Meir Omer, Gedolat Teshuvah, Shebishvil Yachid She'asa Teshuvah, Mochlin L'Kol Ha'olam Kulo. So I think this is like kind of the most poignant and amazing image of Teshuvah as a miracle. Rabbi Meir says, Teshuvah is so great that if one person does Teshuvah, this means that everybody else are forgiven. I think this is a kind of beautiful way to reimagine what it means to confess in the plural on Yom Kippur. Okay. So we don't need to go through the whole pasuk, but that's one kind of really amazing model of like there's some kind of cosmic shift that goes on. There's also, I think, a slightly different version, which we can see a few lines down from Reish Lakish, which goes like this. Amar Reish Lakish, גדולה תשובה שזדונות נעשות לו כשגגות, שנאמר שובה ישראל את השם אלוקיך כי שאלת בפניך. So here, Reish Lakish, and I want you to keep in mind that it was Reish Lakish because we're going to see Reish Lakish pop up again towards the end. Reish Lakish is suggesting just that God takes an eraser to the ledger and is like, yeah, if you do Teshuvah, I'm going to move things from the intentional sin column into the unintentional sin column, for which, right, sort of generally in the tradition, it seems like we receive less severe punishment. So we're just going to kind of shift things from one position to the other. Why? Because it says in Hosea, return, O Israel, to Lord your God, for you have stumbled because of your sin. Now, the Gemara is going to get upset about this word stumble. Why? Because stumbling isn't a great word to use for intentional sins, right? Seems like we talk about stumbling, it seems like it's something that happens by mistake, so we don't want to use that as the word that we're going to make this claim about moving things from the intentional side of the ledger to the unintentional side of the ledger. So the Gemara is like, I don't like this at all, right? So he's going to say, ha'avon mezidhu v'kari le'michshol. On what basis do you get to say that the sins, which are intentional, that was the whole point of our reading of this pasuk, how do we get to say that they're intentional and also call them a mitzvah, kind of stumbling or stumbling block? The Gemara is like, I don't like it. So they're going to come along, Reish Lakish is going to have to reformulate his original claim. So he responds, Amy, really? Is that true? How could you possibly say that? V'ha'amar Reish Lakish. This is didn't Reish Lakish say this other thing, which might be better formulated? Teshuvah gdola teshuvah shezidonot na'asot lo kizichuyot. So now, in a certain way, the Gemara is twisting it around because initially Reish Lakish made a kind of restrained suggestion where okay, you made these intentional sins. If you did Teshuvah for them, that's great. So I'm going to move them into the more limited category of unintentional sins where you still did them, but we're going to kind of treat them with less intensity and severity. Reish Lakish is you didn't like that? I got something better for you. I'm going to move the intentional sins and treat them as if they were merits, as if they were good things that you did. And that, I think, is a kind of much more drastic shift. So in a certain way, the Gemara, and the imagined Reish Lakish picture who's sort of participating in this dialogue, it was constructed probably after he ever said any of this, is upping the ante a little bit. Okay, so what's going to be their proof text? Uvashuv resha mirishato asa mishpat v'tzedaka alehem v'yechid. Maybe whatever. The Bible scholars have a nice activity about figuring out the verb form, which we're not going to engage in that. But so Reish Lakish is going to point to this pasuk in Yechezkel, who's I think in some ways one of the prophets who thinks most interestingly about Teshuvah. And he's going to say, when a wicked man turns back from his wickedness and does what is just and right, he will live on the basis of that. Okay, so this proof text is a little tricky because it doesn't quite say what he wanted it to say. It doesn't say when a person does Teshuvah from their bad behaviors, it's as if they did good things. Right? What Yechezkel is describing is a person does bad things, and then they turn away from those bad things and start to do good things, right? They turn around from their wicked behavior, and they start to do mishpat ustaka, right? So this doesn't quite fit with the miraculous model, but there is still that sort of sense of miraculousness to it by the sense that God is going to preserve your life on this basis. So that I think that there's already starting to emerge in Reish Lakish some of the tension I want to explore, where the model of this that just is about God intervening because you ask God to intervene isn't going to be sort of sustainable in the long term, because there is this, this sense that actually what's going on is a shift inside the person's kind of own moral compass, where they started out being a bad person who always acted poorly, and they turned themselves around to walk like in a better path. Okay, so the Gemara is like, but wait a minute, actually, there's no problem between the two versions of Reish Lakish, right? I sort of described the second Reish Lakish as like upping the ante, but then if you're the son of Gemara, you're the kind of editorial voice of the Gemara, you're going to say like, wait a minute, it's great that he upped the ante, but they don't fit together, these two views, right? You can't say, oh yeah, intentional sins become unintentional sins, and also intentional sins become merit. That doesn't make any sense if we're going to preserve this metaphor of like a ledger that's being regulated. Okay, so that's not going to work. Black Kashia, and we're like, no, don't worry, there's no problem here. Kan me'ahava, kan me'ira. So in one case, he's talking about when a person repents out of love, and in another case, he's talking about when a person repents out of fear, right? So I think that the idea is supposed to be that the repentance out of love is a more kind of fundamental transformation than the repentance out of fear. The repentance out of fear, or even awe, right? Like I think we can translate ira in the kind of more the less pejorative sense, right? Fear seems like it's a bad thing. Awe seems like it's kind of coded as good. I think it's important that in Hebrew it's the same word, so maybe that coding doesn't get preserved quite as well in like our in Hebrew and in Jewish context. I think that's like one interesting thing to think about, especially in the Musar text we're going to be looking at in a couple of weeks, where they are all about Yirat Hashem all the time, and it can seem very negative, but it need not be. That, right, the person who repents just out of awe or just out of, oh my goodness, God could do something bad to me, is still operating in a world where like what matters is what sin did I do and what punishment like goes with that sin. And at the point at which we're actually talking not in this kind of ledger sphere, but we're actually talking about what kind of fundamental change might go on in the person, then we're really talking about something that's done out of love. We can then imagine love for whom, right? Love for other people, love for God, seems to be kind of obvious things, but I think we can expand it to think about like love for the people we might have been harming in acting poorly, etc. So I think already in the sort of second Reish Lakish, you start to see some of the version that I think is a kind of more familiar version of Teshuvah for us in a lot of ways, which is not to treat Teshuvah as a miracle, but to treat Teshuvah as something that is like really about a shift in our character. Does anyone have like just questions about what's going on in this text, or thoughts about the two versions of Reish Lakish and maybe which one you might find more compelling? Anything of that sort before we go on. I'm especially interested if you have thoughts about the distinction between kind of doing something out of love and doing something out of fear. So you should feel free to raise hand or also type something into the chat. Okay, so there's oh, go ahead, Renata, you raised your hand, so why don't you go first, and then I have a couple of questions from the chat, so go ahead.
Sure. So I was wondering about the distinguishing between motivation out of love and fear, and wondering if it might affect kind of an idea of whether what you're doing or what you're trying to change is a maximum or a minimum. If you're acting out of love, can you ever kind of do all the thing you're trying to do? Is it ever a way to kind of maximally fulfill the like duty of love, versus if you're acting out of fear, like you just have to cross a minimum threshold?
Right. I think that's exactly right. Like I think part of what's going on in this distinction is, if all that matters to you is did I sort of tick the box, then actually having just done it bishogeg, right? Having just sinned accidentally becomes becomes sort of enough, right? Like that's all you need, because you've met the bottom, the baseline level, which is like, I've tried as best as I could, and the fact that I failed is sort of out of my hands, right? I think that's sort of a mentality of like, you can't catch me on anything, right? If I sin accidentally, nobody has cause to come back against me and sort of try to hold me responsible. There's nothing they can do. And so I'm just trying to avoid the thing that I'm fearful of, which is basically punishment. Whereas if I'm doing it out of love, then it starts to be kind of something I'm doing, trying to go above and beyond, right? I'm trying to see that I can do something that this let's imagine it's a person as opposed to God, but we'll get there in a minute, wasn't expecting, and like didn't expect that I would do for them, right? That's a very different model than thinking about just trying to tick the box. I'm told that Rav Bigman from Yeshivat Ma'ale Gilboa often refers to this as shitata brownie points, the sort of approach of brownie points, and I think that part of what's going on here is a kind of rejection of this, like just thinking about it as just checking the box. Okay, a couple things that have popped up in the chat. Yeah, so Jenny is saying, it would be really great to talk about what does it mean for a sin to become a merit, and like how does that happen? What does it mean? I think one of the things you suggested from the Rambam, and we'll see the Rambam is actually getting it from a Gemara that we're going to look at on the next page, maybe what it means for your sin to become a merit is you re-encounter the same situation, but you choose a different outcome. I think that's one option. That's a very kind of Rambam style, like very rationalist approach, which I, as a trained philosopher, am like have a deep love for, but may also be kind of not the only game in town. I want to open us up to the possibility that, like, to the extent that we think of God as like really a mamash sitting in front of a book with what we have done written in it, however we're going to imagine that, actually what's happening is the process of having done Teshuvah for your sin moves that sin into a different column, and God like views it differently. And maybe also then other people around us should view it differently. Now, I think where this gets tricky, one place it gets tricky at least, is this opens you up to the possibility that it's good, that like one way to get merit is to sin and then do Teshuvah. And like that's a great way to like stack up things in the good column, so to speak. Which leads to a pretty kind of troubling moral psychology where you're like seeking out doing bad things that you can then do Teshuvah for. That, is a problematic approach in a lot of ways. And one way to kind of get around that is to realize they're not the same kinds of merits, right? Like not all zechuyot are the same, and we can all think about the fact that they're not only in terms of magnitude, but also in terms of kind of content. And that God, in making some evaluation of these different merits, actually cares about that content and thinks about it and is interested in the differences between those things. So it's not that like it would obviously be better if you never sinned at all. That's a kind of, I think, hypothetical that doesn't make any sense. Like most people sin, that's just what it is. And it wouldn't be good to seek out sinning and then doing Teshuvah on your people, right? Or seek out sinning and then expect that on Yom Kippur you'll get let off the hook, but rather that there's some kind of more qualitative, like deeper analysis that's being made here. Ozzy, we're totally going to the stuff about converts, so just like hold that thought for 2 minutes. Interesting. So one thing that got suggested in the chat is that Reish Lakish is only talking about sins between a person and God, but that it wouldn't necessarily apply to wrongs being done to a person. I think certainly the first half of Reish Lakish probably is about sins between a person and God, if only because I think the strong language of zidonot ushgagot usually is used that way in rabbinic context. Though we might want to kind of midrashically or playfully say that's not the only way to read this, right? We could we would have to be making a jump beyond what the rabbinic language sort of directly authorizes. But that might be a great thing and really productive. Yeah, the other thing that got raised in the chat is the suggestion that actually the whole point of Teshuvah is that we're forgiven. That's what Teshuvah is. I think it's one vision of what Teshuvah is, but it's not the only one. If you look at that whole sequence that these couple of excerpts are drawn from in the Bavli and Yoma, you'll see versions of Teshuvah that imagine that a person goes back to the same sin over and over again, and that their relationship to that sin changes over time. So if by forgiven we mean it's erased, it's as if it never happened, I don't think that's kind of the right picture of what's going on with forgiveness in, at least in this little segment of text in the Bavli. It seems like there's some change in relationship that occurs every time you encounter a sin, and it's not the case that we're totally let off the hook. If you sin one way and do Teshuvah and then repeat the sin, that has certain effects that wouldn't have sort of kicked in if you had just done it once. So I think we talk about Yom Kippur as this wiping clean of the slate, but a lot of this goes back to the kind of reading I'm trying to push you towards, which is one where the zichuyot and avonot, the sins and the merits, are viewed qualitatively for what they are in all of their complexity, so that it's not just, okay, you did Teshuvah, your slate is clean, but your whole narrative can include moving beyond things that you've done, but it doesn't mean that we kind of just wipe off what came before. Does that make sense? Other questions, or maybe Michael, if you see people on Facebook Live, that would be awesome. Otherwise, we'll move on. Great. Okay, so we had some suggestions about the kind of the Rambam and Hilchot Teshuvah, whom we will see in spades next week. But in the meantime, I want to look at a couple sources that actually the Rambam uses as kind of the basis for his picture of Teshuvah, which really is about changing character. Okay, so these are also from this kind of long statement of, Rabbi so-and-so says that Teshuvah is this. And I think actually for we'll do both. Okay, great. So in the first one, again, the meat of the Gemara is, oh no, this is the same text twice. Yes, no, it is not. All right. Okay, great. We're just going to go on to the second text under Roman numeral 2, which is Yoma, Pei Zayin. They're all from Pei Zayin, but this is the one about who is it who's done Teshuvah. So this is the text that we're referencing that the Rambam loves to quote. Heichidami bal Teshuvah. What does it mean for a person to do Teshuvah? I think actually it's nicer to kind of lean into the language of what is a person who's done Teshuvah like? What is their story like? What do they look like? What do they sound like? How do they carry themselves? Amar Rav Yehuda, Kigon shevat liyado davar avera pan rishona ushniya v'nitzil himena. Okay, so those of you who have the Rambam in your head know that the Rambam does all kinds of reconstructive work to make this somewhat unclear line of Gemara into beautiful Hebrew. Here's how he's, right, so he'll say, oh yes, what this means is you do exactly the same thing in exactly the same place. And the first time you sin, and the second time you don't sin. That seems to be, that's one way to read it, but I think it's a little tricky to read it that way because it's Pam Rishona Ushnia Vinzil Hemena. So it seems like it's almost 3 stages. It's like you did it once, you did it twice, and then the third time you were saved, you saved yourself from it, i.e. you didn't do it. But it could be, I think we can parse that text in different ways as we choose. So Rabbi Yehuda is not like super, at least the Gemara's imagination of Rabbi Yehuda doesn't think that this is a sufficient explanation of what being a Baal Teshuvah is. And so he wants to kind of like put some meat on the bone and put some real color into the story, which like brings in all kinds of like complicated gender aspects of this text, which I'm happy to talk about. Masbei Rabbi Yehuda clarifies, Be'ota isha, be'oto perek, be'oto makom. Yeah, in case you didn't know what it means to do the same sin or to encounter the same sin and then not actually commit the sin in quite the same way. What it means is to, obviously we're talking about a sexual sin, so you encounter the same woman at the same time in the same place. All of the conditions are the same, but you don't intervene, right? You don't do anything. Like the Rambam says, you basically run away. Okay, so this, I think, seems to be about a kind of fundamental transformation in the kind of person you are, or at least in sort of what your inclinations are and your relationship to them, right? So what we don't see here, which I think is important and will be very important for what we see next week, a lot of the kind of classical philosophers, certainly Aristotle and his kind of more modern interpreters, love to say that what it means to change your character is to have some bad inclination and then to just like train yourself out of having the inclination at all. That's not quite what we see here, because it's not that this person wants to sin, like doesn't want to have sex with this woman this person is not supposed to have sex with. Text assumes that it's a man, but rather that they may want to do that, but they just don't do it. They have the ability to kind of, philosophers would say, a second order desire. You have one desire on one level, and then you have a second level desire. And that second level desire is going to come in and say, no, I'm not going to do this. And that, in this story, can be a picture of sort of full Teshuvah. Even if that's not the kind of full character transformation in which, like, you don't even have the desire to do it. Maybe just that you encounter the same circumstance, but you have like stronger, we often say willpower, though I hate that term. You were able to kind of put aside whatever inclination you had. I think this model of Teshuvah is both, on the one hand, more familiar, and on the other hand, like sets a much higher bar for us. So on the one hand, this model, first of all, doesn't require some like very sort of like Hebrew school style theology in which God sits with a book and is like putting little check marks and little columns. What it means to do Teshuvah is not, and the effect of Teshuvah is not to sort of like move things from one category to the other. What it means to do Teshuvah is, and the effect of Teshuvah in a certain way, is to be able to be in the same situation and not make the same mistakes twice. That also may mean, though it's a kind of more, let's say, naturalistic, to use the kind of academy's word, the more kind of doesn't rely on some crazy theology approach, it also, I think, like sets a very high bar. It makes it very difficult to have really done Teshuvah for something. I think, you can all think back personally to moments on Yom Kippur or at other times in the kind of El to Yamim Noraim swing, where you've attempted to get yourself not to make the same mistakes, but you keep doing it. And even if you ask for forgiveness, and even if you try to do Teshuvah either by asking for forgiveness from the people you've wronged, or by or in prayer, right? You've said those lines that we started with like great fervor. You may not necessarily be able to achieve this. this is like extremely difficult, and it's very hard to get ourselves to the point where we, you know, wouldn't make the same mistake again. So I think this is a more familiar model, but in some ways I think it's like way harder to kind of, we may assume at the beginning that like the version where God has to intervene is like the crazy model that would be hard to like get yourself behind and kind of buy into. But I want to like maybe suggest that this model is also really hard to buy into if we're honest with ourselves about our own conduct. And even like one way into that honesty might be to think about people you know who try to change over and over again, and they make the same mistakes. They just keep doing it. They can't help themselves, right? There's no, like, they don't have the tools to get out. And I think we see that in ourselves, and we see it a lot in other people, I think. But that's the sort of other model of Teshuvah that's floating around. I'm interested in whether people think that this model is too high a bar, whether it's a sort of reasonable bar, and whether like in your own life this has been a text, like, interested for people to get a little bit more personal here about like ways in which this text or this model of Teshuvah has either been helpful or like potentially like unuseful. So feel free to jump into the chat as you wish. Okay, we can think about that, and feel free to type in as we're going. But as we move into part 3, I want to think about what it looks like, not only from the kind of, now up to this point, we've been thinking about Teshuvah as a process that takes place between a person and God, or between a person and the person they've wronged. But I want to think kind of on a much broader communal level about what it would mean to adopt either of these visions of Teshuvah. And also like how our kind of communal interactions might help someone meet this high bar of real character transformation, or even become the kind of person for whom their sins can become merit. So in order to do that, we're going to take a like brief journey into the world of nizikin, of damages, and Bavli. And we're going to look at a few texts. So the first is a classic Mishneh that some people mentioned in the chat a little bit earlier, about kind of various kinds of exploitation. And one of the like joys of learning nizikin is the ways that like nizikin will throw in things that seem like totally unconnected and knit them all together in a beautiful way. And this Mishneh is like an excellent example of this, right? This is like kind of humdrum Mishneh that's about finances, and all of a sudden it's like taken a different turn. So here we go. Kishem she'ona'a b'mekach u'menkar, kach ona'a b'dvarim. So just as there is some kind of like form of exploitation that requires a person to be paid damages and compensated, just as there's that kind of exploitation in buying and selling in, you know, just standard business dealing, so too there's also what we call ona'at dvarim. There's an exploitation that can take place in words. And the real money, as always, is what is the examples that the Mishneh gives for this. Lo ya'amer lo b'chama hafetz zeh. How much does this? Don't say to a shopkeeper, how much does this thing cost? V'hu eino rotze likach. Don't ask that question if you don't want to buy it. Why? Because the person's going to get their hopes up, right? They're going to get an expectation this person might buy this. And if you're just like asking for fun, then you've created a kind of imbalance of expectations that's problematic. All right, and this is where I want to focus. Im haya bal teshuvah, lo yamar lo zechor ma'asecha harishonim. Don't, if this person is someone who's repented, don't come and say to them, remember that thing you did. Im hu ben gerim, lo yamar lo zechor ma'aseh avotach. Shene'emar v'ger lo ta'anu v'lo tisachot. So if he's the child of converts, playing with the biblical meaning of ger, which doesn't originally mean that, but this is how the rabbis like to read things. Don't say to a convert, remember the deeds of your parents, because it says don't oppress or mistreat a convert. All right, what's going on here? This text is asking that in your kind of interactions with other people, you adopt what I was calling kind of the first model of teshuvah. Meaning, you need to be willing to say, there's been some fundamental transformation here, and I'm not gonna like take you back to the world where there wasn't that transformation. God has sort of wiped the slate clean, and that means I have to respect that. And that can mean, this person has been like reborn as a Jewish person, and it can mean this person has done teshuvah for the things that they've done in the past. And so even though, we might want like more complicated narrative of how the person relates to their past, this text is asking you to adopt the like, teshuvah is a miracle, and I need to treat it as such. And actually, if I don't treat it as such, then I've like created material harm against this person. I think because you've sort of taken away their transformation. You've like, it's almost like it's damages to who they are, to kind of recall them back to things that seem like they should have been at least erased or gotten rid of. So again, so this mission I think is sort of thinking in terms of that first model. Does that make sense? Questions about that? Okay, good. So I'm just gonna pop back to what Ozzy said earlier about this. All right, so Ozzy was trying to connect this question to the like, oh, never mind. All right, sorry, I misread what was going on in that chat. But I think, yeah, this is a version of the first model. And again, I think sets a really high bar for us, right? So not only do we, when we sort of pray for teshuvah as a miracle for ourselves, we like imagine teshuvah as a miracle, but also this Mishneh is saying, yeah, you got to believe it's a miracle and it's done for other people. So I think not like the standard theology that we adopt towards all kinds of transformations, but to make it real, we have to engage in that way. Okay, great. So now we're going to turn to a little snippet of like one of the classic stories that the Gemara loves to tell about its two main figures. Remember that I said earlier that we spent a lot of time with our friend Reish Lakish. And Reish Lakish is going to come back with a vengeance here, because Reish Lakish is someone who himself not only sort of theorized teshuvah, but also underwent it, and underwent it under sort of complicated circumstances that are contextualized by our Mishneh. I'm going to summarize parts of this outside so we can jump into the kind of meatiest parts, and then make sure that we see the last text as well. So, right, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish runs into Rabbi Yochanan, who's bathing in the Jordan. He's like, you know what? So Rabbi Yochanan's like, your strength should be for Torah, and then calls him out and says, come join me, come return to a life of Torah. Reish Lakish seems to be a thief in this scenario. He's like running around with bandits. And Reish Lakish thinks he's got a smart retort, so he says, yeah, your beauty should be for women. Rabbi Yochanan is generally known as being especially beautiful. He seems to have a glowing arm. If you want to read amazing analysis of this, check out Boyarin's Plato and the Fat Rabbis, one of the best titled books in Jewish studies. And then Rabbi Yochanan basically promises Reish Lakish's sister, who is especially beautiful. He seems to figure out like what's important for Reish Lakish in this scenario, and Reish Lakish is like, okay, I'll do it. I'm in. I'm sold. All right, and this is the next piece that I wanna think about together. So whatever it means for Reish Lakish to have taken this, to have accepted this offer, he then goes and learns Mishneh and Torah and Mishneh, and he becomes a great man. Okay, this is the sort of second chunk of text. All right, so if you're following along in the Hebrew, it's like just after the little colon, the second line down. Yom echad hava miflagei be'ei midrasha. One day they were debating in the Beit Midrash. Hasayif hasakin hefkeyon haruma umegadel yan umagel katsir me'ematai mekablim tuma. So they're asking a very technical question about tuma. technical question goes like this. You have all these different kinds of swords and knives and daggers, sickles, all kinds of metal instruments that cut things that are potentially violent. How do I know when those things can become susceptible to impurity? Why is this a question? Somewhere between a knife becoming a useful knife and having a hunk of metal, the knife becomes a knife. And when it does, then it becomes susceptible to impurity and all kinds of consequences from that. So they're asking this like very technical question. And the answer is, Misha Askamar Melachta, from the time that they are finished. Okay, not a super satisfactory answer. Why? How do I know when the thing is finished? We ask that question. Me'amate Gemar Melachtan, Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Miyitzarfan de Kivshan. From the Rabbi Yochanan says, I know from the time that they're forged in the furnace. Rish Lakish is like, I don't like that answer, probably because it's still bendy, it's still hot. Rish Lakish Amar, Mishi Yitzichan B'mayim. No, it's when they're cooled in the water. That's when they really become solid and finished. All right. This is where things get complicated. Rabbi Yochanan is going to say to Reish Lakish, you know your tools of war. In a way, this is, or tools of banditry, right? Amarle, lista b'tzulai huyada. So in a way, there's a kind of concession to Reish Lakish's position, right? Halakhically, he's going to say, you know the answer. You know more about what it means to make a knife or a dagger than I do. I'm going to give in to you. But even in the same breath as he says that, he's like waiting for the other punch, right? The other punch is, you know this, and I'm going to agree with you because you have all this expertise from being a bandit. What he's basically done, right, is exactly what this Mishnah told you not to do. Remind him that he was a bandit. Now, all right, Rish Lakish gets a little testy, and he's going to respond. Amarle, umaya hadaitle. What good did you do to me? Like, what help were you in all of your teaching and all of this training you gave me? Hatam Rebbe Karuli, Hata Rebbe Karuli. There, i.e. when I was a bandit, they called me Rebbe because I was like in charge. And here too, they also call me Rebbe because I am like a great master. Amarle, ahaylacha the akruvin chatacha kantei Shechina. I helped you because I brought you under the wings of Shekhinah. So what I'd like to hear from you is, do you think that Reish Lakish has actually undergone a transformation? Is he actually a Baal Teshuvah in such a way that then Rabbi Yochanan is kind of deeply in the wrong here for calling him out and pointing to this, Teshuvah that's supposed to have been, or this past wrongdoing that's supposed to have been erased? Or is this transformation not quite as complete as it seems like it ought to be? I'm also interested in what you make of Rabbi Yochanan's answer, if anyone wants to hop in here. Anyone? Anyone think Reish Lakish has totally undergone the transformation? Rabbi Yochanan is obviously in the wrong. Yeah, go ahead. Renana, I see your hand raised.
Yes. And it's just interesting that he responds with this idea of well, I got a lot of respect and I was important as a bandit. Same here. It might imply that he cares a lot about how people see him, his status in whatever world he chooses to be in. That doesn't necessarily mean he hasn't done Teshuvah, but it might imply that not all of his values are in order.
Right. So you might say, look, if the only way he responds to Rabbi Yochanan, I think potentially crossing a line, is to say, all that I care about is kind of what my status is, then it seems like he hasn't understood the fundamental transformation that he was supposed to have undergone. Because the fundamental transformation is, someone who's kind of not under the wings of Shekhinah into someone who is. I think the two other like ways to kind of mitigate that are worth thinking about is, first is just, it's not as if the rabbinic culture into which Rabbi Yochanan brings Reish Lakish is one where status is not central, right? Status is extremely important to them. They're obsessed with kind of learning as a marker of status. So it can't just be that that's like a sideshow. That has to be, you know, the fact that he cares about this is something that he's kind of socialized into by the system. It's not that he like woke up one morning like, I would like to be super powerful. Like there is a kind of context for being called master that is accepted within the rabbinic tradition, and that comes with certain privileges to have that title, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a way in which, yeah, he may not have undergone the transformation, but he may also be reflecting the values of the culture that he's been socialized into. I think there's also a way in which this is the response. If it's just about, oh, I have status here and I have status there, then it doesn't quite make sense, because the whole point is Rabbi Yochanan has just denied him in a certain way a kind of more important form of status, right? He's been willing to concede the halachic argument, but he's not been willing to give him the status of someone who's done full teshuvah. So there's a way in which he hasn't kind of lived up to, he doesn't achieve the status that he says he's achieved, right? People call him master, but they don't treat him the same as everybody else. So there's a way in which, like, he's saying, oh yeah, here they treat me this way, and they also treated me the same way over there. He actually doesn't totally believe it. There's something kind of more, he's calling out the fact that he's not taking it totally seriously. Okay, I want to, there's some other comments in the chat, but I want to just hop ahead to this last text, because I think it gives us a really interesting model for thinking about what it would mean to help someone along in the kind of character transformation that we expect, like that we think of as part of Teshuvah, and also to, I think, thereby kind of participate in this like miraculous process. So here's another great little short Bava Metzia story. Rabbi Bar Hanan Tavrule Hanu Shukale Chazita Dechamra. So Rabbi Bar Hanan is a like fancy guy, and he has some workers, and they broke his wine barrel. He's not pleased about it, so he decides that what he's going to do is take their cloaks. Shakal Leglimahu. Why does he do it? A couple of reasons. Probably just he thinks that he wants them to pay him back for the wine barrels, but presumably they may not have enough money to do that. Or he wants to kind of take their cloak as a kind of collateral for eventually them working off the wine barrels, something of that sort. All right. The workers, unsurprisingly, are displeased by this. On to Amru L'Rav. They came and they told Rav about this, presumably being like, no, this is not a good situation. Help us out. Amar Le, Havlahu L'Gumai. He says to them, go and give them their cloaks. So Rav hears this story and then goes and finds Rabbi Bar Bar. Like, no, you don't get to get away with it. You got to give them back. But he's not so pleased with this request to give back the cloaks. So he responds, Amar Le, Dina Hachi? This is a horrible line to translate, because what the word Dina, like, Dina captures a lot here. But it seems like, is this the rule that I have to follow? Do I have to do this? Or even like, does the logic of the rules compel me to do this? Is this the halacha that I must follow? And the most important thing I want you to see is Rav's amazing answer. Rav says, Amar Le, in, yes, you do. It is the rule that you must follow. But as always with rabbinic text, the money is in the proof text. Leman tilech b'derech tovim. Why? So his citation for the good halachic rule is a pasuk from Mishneh, a verse from Proverbs. This is not like the home to good halachic rules. This is the home to like little pieces of advice that are kind of, sort of Aesop's fable style. So what he's actually giving you in response to the claim, like, does the moral rule say I have to follow this, is an appeal to the virtue, right? To use philosophical language. So Rabbi Bar Khan is like, do I have to do it? And Rav says, yes. Why? Because the Torah says, so that you will walk in the way of the good, so that you will do good things. And what it means to do good things is not to take away these people's cloaks, even if, like, realistically, you are owed that. Okay. They said to him, something else happened. Ani anan, we're very poor. V'tarchinan kula yoma, v'kasinan, v'leitlan midei. We're very poor, and we work hard all day, and we're hungry, and we don't have enough. So presumably, this piece of the story gives us a much bigger background. It's not this one incident where there were these vessels broken, and now the workers owe their boss money for the vessels. No, there's a kind of broader context of oppression here. And Rav says to him, Zil, have igrahu, you have to give them their wages. Presumably, the background here is like he's not giving them the wages, or at least he's not giving them enough, right? A living wage. Amarle, dina hafi. He says, do I have to do it? Amarle, in. Rav says, yes, you do. And here again, he's going to quote the same verse from Mishneh, but it's the second half. Ve'orchot tzadikim tishmor. You have to keep the paths of the righteous. So again, he doesn't cite some verse. It's like, oh yes, and also you need to give your workers X and Y. You have to, I'm going to appeal to some virtue, some general trait you're supposed to have, some general way you're supposed to carry yourself in the world. And that's what I'm going to use to kind of hold you to this rule. So one thing that we see like in this picture, or in this little story, is that Rabbi Bar Khan isn't actually a nice guy, right? He seems to be oppressing his workers, not only in this kind of one incident, but in general, he seems to be not treating them well and not providing them with like the ability to feed themselves. And Rav's answer is not, oh, the Talmud says X and Y, and Mishneh says X and Y, right? We have the Talmud, okay. Our law says you need to pay them. But rather, I'm going to hold you to a higher standard. I'm going to expect that you're going to not only do what's minimally required, but also what is good and what is righteous. So in a way, like Rav is the voice of the kind of character transformation model of Teshuvah, but it's a voice that is also like expecting something of Rabbi Bar Khan that's almost miraculous. Because he's not a good guy. He seems to be oppressing his workers, and it's like unclear to me that like, okay, he's got a nice verse from Mishneh that's going to transform him, but he's like constantly saying, you've got to hold yourself to a better standard. You've got to hold yourself to actually living well and not just living by kind of the bare minimum. So there's a way in which like Rav in this story is the voice of both models. He's the voice of you can become a different person. You can become the kind of person who treats their workers well and thereby walks in the paths of the good. And the only way for you to do that is for you to like fundamentally change who you are in such a way that it would be like a miraculous transformation. And I totally believe that that's possible for you, right? By saying this, I'm asking you to leap up to that level. So I think this is the model that we have to kind of think about for those around us is what would it look like to actually think Teshuvah is a miracle that happens all the time, and it happens because we talk about and expect from others in like a kind of kind and loving and hopefully not too aggressive way. We expect that people live well and not just that they like tick all the boxes. And we say that to them, and we trust that that's a possibility for them, even when it to us may not seem seem possible. So that's where I want to leave us for this week. Thank you so much for learning together. Next week, we will spend some time with the Rambam, who is in some ways the master of these questions, and has a really interesting story about what it means for communities to participate in Teshuvah. Thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure to learn with you.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah. This has been a really, really wonderful and thought-provoking class with a lot of really great stories. I just wanted to quickly let folks know about some of the different things that we have on tap this week for our Elul program. We're running 9 different courses throughout Elul and into the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah with Drisha. So the ones that are coming up later this week include tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern, we have a class on Akedat Yitzchak with Rabbi David Silber that's going to be starting up tomorrow. And then on Thursday, we have 2 more classes. At 1 p.m. Eastern, we have the series Seek Me and Live, Hasidism and the Spiritual Journey with Rabbi Dr. Ariel Evan Mays. And at 8 p.m., we have Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Zager teaching on the Kapara of Yom Kippur. All of that information, including registration information and more, can be found on our website. There is info that I will post in just a moment in the chat about our upcoming classes, but please feel free to go there to get a little bit more information, to register. And obviously this class will continue to meet for another few weeks, running both next week, 31st, and then the week after on September 7th from 8 to 9 p.m. So we'd be thrilled to see you back here next week for this class and for some of our other classes as well. And you can find that information at drisha.org/classes. Thank you all so much for being here and have a great evening.